I'm Mark Pearce. I'm the CEO of Volunteering Australia. I'd like to welcome you all to this event today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we're all meeting on today. I'm in Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, extend those respects to traditional custodians across this land, and further extend those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us on this call today. Welcome. We've had over 250 registrations for this event today, and I think that demonstrates Australia's commitment to being a strong and engaged member of the global volunteering ecosystem. So thank you and welcome. In December 2023, the United Nations General Assembly declared that 2026 would be the year of Volunteers for Sustainable Development, or IAVE 2026. And IAVE 2026 provides us with the opportunity to do three things, probably a whole lot more, but there are three that I'll focus on. First of which is to focus on the power and the potential of volunteering. Secondly, to deliver greater investment into volunteering. And lastly, to secure commitments from governments and others on how they will support volunteering and enable volunteering to flourish into the future. We've got an engaged discussion ahead of us, and it's my pleasure to pass over to Sarah Wilson to get to today's discussion underway. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good morning to everyone else joining me from Whadjuk Noongar country over here in not so sunny Perth, Western Australia today, or hopefully that will pick up as the day goes on. But I certainly won't be complaining about the temperature to my eastern colleagues. Today's discussion really is an opportunity for us to consider the future of volunteering, including what needs to change and who has the power to change it. But I want everyone to think about today's conversation in the position of us being the voice of Australia. So even though all of us exist in different microcosms of this beautiful country, today our aim is to present a united voice into this global dialogue to inform the course of action for IAVE 2026. At the end of today, we'll also send you a survey to provide further information and input to the broader global dialogue piece of work that's happening from IAVE. But today is really a chance for us to think about what priorities Australia would like to put forward into that conversation. Before we delve into the international conversation, though, we thought it was a good time to refresh everyone, although hopefully many of you are very across our own national strategy for volunteering, because it provides a really important foundation for this conversation. We're in a really fortunate position here in Australia that we have a national strategy for volunteering, which is something that not a lot of other countries have in place at the moment. And it means that we are coming at this conversation and have maybe a different kind of input to other people who are just considering some of these questions for the first time. So Zach's going to do a little bit of a primer on the national strategy and refresh people's memories on what it's all about before we delve into how we then amplify that to the global conversation about how we want Australia to be represented in IAVE 2026. Over to you, Zach.
Thanks, Sarah. So my name is Zach Reimers. I'm the Director of the National Strategy for Volunteering here at Volunteering Australia. The National Strategy for Volunteering, as Sarah mentioned, we are in a fortunate position in Australia of having this 10-year national strategy that's co-owned by what we term the volunteering ecosystem. And that's all of us in this room, as well as thousands and thousands of people outside of the room, volunteers, beneficiaries of volunteering, researchers and academics, policy makers, volunteer involving organizations, leaders of volunteers, everyone you can think of where volunteering touches their lives or has some relevance to what they do in communities, organizations, or by themselves acting in their own way to fulfill their mission. So the National Strategy for Volunteering in Australia is our 10-year roadmap running through to the 2030s towards a stronger future for volunteering. In our case, we have a lot of alignment with other domestic strategies as well. So your organization, your group, or you as an individual, you're part of the volunteering ecosystem, but you likely belong to another area as well, such as health, sport, the arts, things like this in community services, where volunteering takes its specific forms. And many of those also have strategic objectives and strategies here within Australia. So for example, The National Strategy for Volunteering is embedded within the not-for-profit blueprint, which has been a significant undertaking of the not-for-profit sector here in Australia. It's also aligned with Play Well and the Sport Volunteer Coalition Action Plan, sport being a major part of formal organised volunteering in Australia. The national strategy is also aligned with many of our state and territory volunteering strategies, and we've now reached a point in Australia where all state and territory jurisdictions have a state or territory level strategy, as well as the national strategy, with the exception of the Northern Territory and Tasmania, who we are expecting a state strategy to be coming up in the future. They've done some development work there. We've also heard from many local government areas who have built upon the national strategy and applied it towards their community, their local area, or their actions as that local level of government, building upon the national strategy and applying it to the needs of their communities. I also know that many people in this room have used the national strategy to inform their development, their recruitment of volunteers, their volunteer management, and improving the volunteer experience. The national strategy has strategic objectives that speak to those goals, but we will share those on screen and come around to a discussion on those shortly. In terms of international collaboration, the national strategy, like Sarah mentioned earlier, we're in a bit of a unique situation, and so other countries have reached out to us and asked for our input, building upon the national strategy for volunteering in Australia to inform the work that they're doing in other countries. So this includes Points of Light, a team working on a national strategy for the USA, also Volunteer Canada, who we had a meeting with. And these are countries around the world where volunteering can take a similar form that's very reminiscent of our experience of volunteering in Australia, but with some unique factors here and there that we need to take into account. We've also had contact and sharing knowledge at world conferences. Sarah went to the World Conference in Korea and met with some contacts there, and we're building upon those relationships to share the good work of the co-design that all of you across the volunteering ecosystem have contributed to, both in the development of the national strategy and the subsequent action plan, which is in place now. We also want to share some research that came out of the United Kingdom. So the UK government, they commissioned some research into volunteering strategies and volunteer enablers. And as one of the things they looked at Australia, our form of volunteering, and the national strategy for volunteering. So I want to take some quotes from this because they really help put things in perspective for us. They said, one of their goals is to learn from the successes reported in countries such as Ireland and Australia. Many research participants saw Australia as leading the way in volunteering policy globally, with many citing the National Strategy for Volunteering as evidence of this. So often in volunteering, we're facing challenges, we're facing barriers, and we're thinking of potential solutions to overcome them. But I think every once in a while, it is worth just taking a step back and getting a bit of perspective of some of the things that we're fortunate to have in terms of our volunteer enabling infrastructure, the levels of investment involvement we get from different governments across Australia, our network of peak bodies, volunteering peak bodies and kindred peak bodies in other sectors that are part of volunteering, as well as all the actions of individual volunteers, communities, and volunteer involving organizations nationally. But thinking about this national and international context, we wanted to open the floor to you in terms of what you think about Australian volunteering and what defines as our unique form of Australian volunteering in your mind. So we're going to share a link in a moment where you'll be able to contribute what 3 words would you use to describe volunteering in Australia to the rest of the world. There's a link to Slido there as well as a code. And so you should have something pop up in your browser as you navigate to that, and you can type in that code there. And in a moment, we're going to start sharing some results on screen. So I'll ask you to please do that. It may be slightly easier if you have 2 screens open at once for those of you at a desktop. Slido.com, and I'll just read it out for anyone who's looking away from their screen right now. It's 134 is the code you're putting in. That's slido.com 4099134. We're going to give people a moment just to populate that, and we're going to share a word cloud of your responses.
And I'm sure most people on the call have seen a word cloud before, but then the words that end up bigger and centered are the ones where we're having more than one response of that particular word. So community is obviously coming through for a lot of people: passionate, dedicated, inclusive, generous, selfless, lots of things that I think all of us who live and breathe this work, whether as paid employees or as volunteers, and most of us wear both of those hats on a day-to-day basis, would agree with. And, you know, I think one of the important things about this conversation is that although Zach has prefaced that we are maybe in a more fortunate position and look to as leaders in this space, we know that things aren't perfect and we've got a lot of work here to do in Australia. And some of the other words coming through around heavily relied upon, undervalued. I saw another one before that said decreasing. You know, these are challenges that are facing not just volunteering in Australia, but volunteers around the world, which really talks to the importance of today's conversation. And how we balance the good with the bad in volunteering is always one of the things that is challenging for us as advocates and people working in this space, volunteering in this space.
I like that someone put in rural connections specifically, because we can find that volunteering often takes different forms between very metro or urban areas and in regional communities, where in some cases people may not even use the term volunteer, and but then go out and spend their time volunteering to help each other. I can see there are still about half a dozen people sharing their thoughts, so we might just give those people a few moments. And with every response, I see the word community getting bigger and bigger. So I think we've hit upon a key theme there. And everything that you're sharing today will help inform some of the advice that we pass on behalf of Australia's volunteering ecosystem to IAVE, the International Volunteering Peak, as they get ready for this global year of volunteer. I think that may be about it, Sarah. Should we...
Yeah, sounds good. And that link will stay live, so feel free to keep adding words if you'd like to. You're also very welcome to share it with other people. If you've got volunteers in your organisation that might be interested in contributing, there'll be ways for people to do that outside this conversation as well. So these global dialogues that are being held around the world are part of the work that is leading into, as we said, IAVE 2026. So the International Association for Volunteer Effort, IAVE, which is the sort of global leaders in this space, they host a world conference every couple of years, actually had a scoping group that they led, which was established to help guide this global conversation. And in its original iteration, that scoping group included 4 leading organisations around the world. So IAVE, the International Forum for Volunteering in Development, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and UNICEF Generation Unlimited. And they came together and they identified the 3 core priorities for the global future of volunteering, which hopefully you see here on your screen right now. So the first one, around championing the value of volunteering, is really about increasing recognition for the importance and value of the volunteers' contribution, making sure that we are recognising how important volunteers are in this conversation, which always sounds like a strange thing to say, but sometimes we can forget that volunteers really are the heart of volunteering, which is why we made that the mission statement or the vision statement for our own national strategy. The second is around enabling volunteering to make a difference. And this one focuses on that enabling environment, which is about maximising the benefits of volunteering and minimising risks for volunteers as well. So really making sure that the environment in which volunteers are doing their work, whatever that looks like and wherever it is safe, is enabling them to enjoy the benefits of what they do, and also making sure that the impact of their work is felt. And finally, significant financial investment in volunteering. And I don't think we ever have one of these kinds of conversations without talking about the importance of resourcing. This is about greater access to resources, and also about making sure that there is significant and sufficient investment in supporting and developing volunteering. And we see quite often, and this is true in Australia, but also around the globe, that access to resourcing, whether that be financial or other, is not always equitable. We see volunteers and volunteer involving organisations definitely doing more than their fair share of heavy lifting when it comes to that. And so these three priority topics that have been identified are those global priorities. And you can see how relevant they are for us in Australian context. We talk about these three things directly, not just in the national strategy, but also in our ongoing advocacy work. And I'm sure for many on the call today within your own organisations, whether you are a researcher or you're a manager of volunteers or leader of volunteers or somebody working in a different part of volunteering, these are things that probably come up in your own spheres quite often, unfortunately, which is something we love to change. So these topics aren't exhaustive. Part of today's dialogues and others around the world is really to test whether these resonate and to uncover what else matters in different contexts. So you might think there are other priorities we need to talk about, and we'd love to hear those reflections and hear those comments. But what we want to do for the next part of the discussion is ask you to look inward. And rather than asking a big sort of general broad question, we want to think about what is happening in your own context, whether you are somewhere in a regional community, whether you're in a metropolitan area, whether you work in volunteering, you are a volunteer, you're here from a research or academic perspective or any number of other hats. We want you to think about the lens that you're bringing to the session today, or multiple lenses that you might bring, and reflect on two key questions, and we'll have them up on the screen. I think Zach's already put them up on the screen, which are, what are you or your organisation or your group doing well against these three things? And what do you wish that you could do or do more of? And we're going to share, and hopefully all goes to plan, a link to a Microsoft Teams form with two open question. I've just popped the link in the chat. Hopefully that will take you through to the Microsoft form, and we'd love people's responses to those two questions against any of the three, each of the three areas there, things that you think we can share from an Australian context, from your local context, and things that if we'd achieved the outcomes across those focus areas, what you wish you could do or do more of. And if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, but we'll give people a couple of minutes to think about responses to those. And I've copied the focus areas at the top of the form as well for people who are maybe navigating one screen.
So for anyone who's looking for the link that Sarah was mentioning and can't quite find it, she mentioned it's in the chat. So you may need to open the chat pane in Teams if you don't have that by default, or you might see a pop-up where Sarah's just shared it again. I can see that people are contributing now, so we'll give people a moment to fill those out and then might invite people to speak to their responses. Jeanette's just put one in the chat, which reminds me as well, at any point, if you're having issues with the forms in your browser or the links to external pages, please feel free to speak to these questions in the chat, and we'll take that into account as well. Thank you.
A lot of the responses coming through for what people think their organisation or know their organisational group already do well are things that don't surprise me at all, having worked in this space for some time, championing volunteers, recognising the work that they do, giving them a voice, making them feel welcome, all things that leaders of volunteers are uniquely talented at doing because we know how important those volunteers are to the work that we do. In terms of some of the responses, and unfortunately for this one, we don't have the ability to sort of share the live results in a way that is as accessible for people on the screen because it keeps refreshing and you lose the old data. But some of the responses coming through to what people wish they could do more of is some of it is around recognition, some of it's around recruitment, more information about the value, impact and ubiquity of volunteering. I love that word myself. I actually was at a meeting with the Sport Volunteer Coalition on Friday, which Volunteering Australia are very privileged to be a part of. And we often talk about one of the success factors of the national strategy would be for volunteering to be as ubiquitous as participating in sport. If there was a future state where every young person in Australia thought about volunteering the same way they do about playing in a team sport, that would be a huge indicator of success given how much the focus that sport does have in Australian communities. Also being the #1 involver of volunteers by sector too, involving over 3 million people a year. Someone mentioned look after the volunteers better once we have them. A tricky piece and not always easy for those who maybe are managing a couple of hundred or if not thousands of volunteers. And we know leaders of volunteers are often in a uniquely difficult position when it comes to doing all of the things that end up being part of their job.
Some that I've just seen come in that are on a theme that I really enjoy are connecting people with meaningful volunteer roles, and also someone has written understanding what our volunteers are capable of and listening to what they want to do while volunteering. Don't just tell them what they should be doing, give them options. And that personalization, speaking to aligning with volunteer motivations and improving the volunteer experience, that's a really powerful factor in terms of our volunteer management. So we've had quite a few responses come in, and we were wondering if anyone would like to raise their hand and share what they spoke about, maybe provide a little more context or a little more detail to the room. If so, you should be able to use the raise hand feature. Should be at the top of your screen if you're on a desktop. While people are considering if they'd like to raise their hand, I'll just share out something Sharon shared in the chat, which is, I wish I had more time to reshape our program to adapt to the flexibility that future volunteers want or need. And this is a trend that we see in volunteering, is that people increasingly want or need flexibility to work around complex schedules, or to reflect our increasingly on-demand life that we have in other realms like our social lives or entertainment. Some people want volunteering to reflect that same dynamic.
And I think we have a hand up from Jeanette. And Jeanette, I think you should be able to take yourself off mute now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes,
can.
We can. I coordinate a volunteer program for the Shire, the LTP program, which Victorians would be familiar with, but maybe not in other states, where we recruit volunteer mentors to enable young people to get their required 120 hours for driving. Our program tends to recruit an older demographic of mentors because they're they're semi-retired or retired and have got the time. But the hardest thing, and I think I'm seeing that in a few of the chats, that the most difficult thing is to get people on younger mentors, because I think obviously in this economic climate, they're far too busy working to try and keep their house over their head. Mm-hmm. But on saying that, I find that most of the young people that we mentor in our program appreciate that older person in their life, and they're valued. And I think that shared experience of different times of lives really does help. But it would be great if we had this magic bottle where we could all recruit younger people. So I'm giving a shout out to all the people over 50 who volunteer.
Fantastic. We'd love to hear it. And that intergenerational linking and people sharing different ways of working with each other, volunteering is a great opportunity for that. And that strengthens all of us when we stay open to different approaches and maybe collaborate with someone that we wouldn't have come across in our lives otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Sarah, I think it looks like we have a couple more hands up as well.
I think the next person was MD.
MD, you should be able to take yourself off mute and share now as well if you're comfortable. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Dr. Jewel. I'm a research assistant at UNSW Canberra, and I'm also the executive member of International Mother Language Movement Canberra, and also the member of ARC UNSW Canberra student body. I want to share just three things that why the young generation are not interested in volunteering, because we need to appreciate them, not just recognition, but we have to go beyond that, that we have to do the study and research that how volunteering actually impacting the economy and the social cohesion in Australia. I mean, in the national strategy, like how the volunteering hours, if we do study and research that, how their hours is actually considered in GDP or the economic value. Second part is that the volunteering organization are the heart of this voluntary ecosystem. If there is a sustainable funding for the volunteering organizations for the training, management, and technologies that can foster the voluntary ecosystem, also the in recruiting new volunteers, they need appreciation so that their time and effort can be considered as a valuable asset in their career or in their personal life. If we can add value to that, then I think more young people will come forward. And the last part is that the philanthropy or big organization or industry or the university and other organizations, if they come forward to promote these voluntary activities, I think more young generation, whether young and old, and everyone will come forward to participate in volunteering. And last point, in terms of Australia, we can share Australian best practices with international body and collaborate with international organizations so that they can understand what the best practices Australia is doing. And through that, we can promote the international volunteering ecosystem throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Spencer, I love the range of points we're getting here. I wish we could speak to everything that we're seeing come through the form, but we've got dozens and dozens of responses, 60, 70 responses coming in already, and I can see other people are typing. So thank you so much for that. We will need to move on to our next area now, but if you have the form open and you're typing or you're typing something in the chat, please feel free to keep typing. We've seen as well, 1 or 2 people are unable to access the chat, but they have put things in the Q&A feature. Wherever works for you to have input and share, we will see it. So please use whatever means are at your disposal to let us know your thoughts so that we can collate them for IAVE. So if we move on to the next slide, Sarah, over to you.
So the key question for all of these global dialogues that are currently happening literally across the globe, so they've been happening in many diverse countries, in many diverse languages, is this doozy of a question, which is considering the realities in your context, what needs to change to better recognise and support volunteering, and who has responsibility for making that change happen? It's a big question. It's a question we have asked ourselves here in Australia many times and continue to. And because we are in the very fortunate position of already having put together our own national strategy to partially answer this particular question, what we wanted to do now is to get your input on what of those 11 strategic objectives that we collectively as a volunteering ecosystem here in Australia have decided will be our roadmap for the next 10 years. Of those, what are the ones that we think can contribute to the basis of this global agenda? So rather than going back to as if we'd never done this exercise before, we want to build on the really good work that's been happening over the last couple of years with the national strategy, and actually get your input on of these. And we split them into our 3 focus areas. Zach's got them there on the screen. There's 11 underneath them. If you are asked to pick which ones you think should be elevated that would resonate most globally, which are the ones that stand out to you? So again, we are going to pop a link to a form in the chat. And this one is a little bit easier. It will ask you simply just to select up to 3 responses. And these are the 3 strategic objectives that you think we should elevate globally. And then we would love to facilitate a discussion on broadly the answers to that big question, but also anything you think is relevant in an Australian context. So I'll just pop the new link into the chat. Sorry, I'm in the Q&A function at the moment. And hopefully for everyone, that's as simple as ticking 3 boxes. And then if anyone would like to share their thoughts, please pop your hand up.
And just to help people who may only be on one screen at a time, we do have the strategic objectives listed in that form question, which you should be able to see in the chat shared by Sarah there. I'll just pop them back up on screen as well and speak to them for a moment while people consider which 3 they'd like to pick. So as Sarah mentioned, we've across Australia, we've fundamentally tackled that question asked by IAVE in a very thorough way through the development of the national strategy, which was led by Sarah and had contributions from people across Australia. And so we have quite a considered idea of what people in the volunteering ecosystem would like to see that falls into these categories. So which three do you think would be best to elevate globally in order to strengthen volunteering, not just in Australia, but through the international volunteering ecosystem? We have some results coming in now, so I'm just going to pop them up on screen also.
And just so you know, your screen is not glitching. It updates every time a new response comes in, which is why it's constantly refreshing. You can see there's a couple of front runners there, although there's no clear, not that it's about winners and losers, but there isn't necessarily three that are ahead of the pack. Oh, now there kind of is three ahead of the pack.
It's a bit like a race,
Yeah.
like people coming in on the final straight of a long distance run or something.
That looks so cool and fancy. This is just in Microsoft Forms. So if anyone uses Microsoft products in their organization, it's very, very easy to set up and use. And the fantastic thing is that we'll be able to provide all of this directly to IAVE. So we're feeding directly into that process. As a result of today's conversation, we will actually be sending them all of the information, all of the input that we've had to help inform their next steps in their design of what actually will happen in IAVE 2026. So that will all actually be launched at the end of this year, I believe around International Volunteer Day. But in the lead up to that, any other input people have, please continue to stay engaged, because it's a huge opportunity for us to be platforming what we do on a global stage. And given that, as Zach mentioned, we are already being increasingly recognised as leaders in this space, it's time for us to think about what does our international responsibility look like and how do we want to play a role in that. And very good point, Kirsten. The ratings will obviously reflect people on the call, of course. So the ratings to this might be different if, say, every single person here was here in the capacity of being a volunteer, or a person working for a government department, or academics who might have different priorities as well based on their own areas of research.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting, and just expanding on Kirsten's point there, that two of the objectives that sort of bookend the national strategy, focusing on the experience of volunteers and recognizing the importance of volunteer management, which within that strategic objective, you could kind of rephrase it as focus on the volunteer manager experience as well, to copy the phrasing of that first one, focus on the volunteer experience. Those are two that people have clicked on some of the most out of the 11 strategic objectives. And I think that goes to show the daily experience of all of us in the volunteering ecosystem. Those are two of the key stakeholders when we consider volunteering and its impact and the actions that we can take. The volunteer and the leader of volunteers, who is often a volunteer themselves, are two of the most important stakeholders within that. And if anyone's in the same situation as Julie, where that outside link to the form isn't popping up for them, please feel free to note the objectives on screen and share them in the chat if you'd prefer to do it that way, or if that's what's available to you. Well, with that in mind, I was wondering if anyone would like to share their thoughts on the three that they picked, which combination, and why? What relevance does that have to your part of volunteering, and what's the greater context, or what perspective are you bringing to that? Why did these three stand out to you, and what role do you think they might have either within your volunteering or within that wider global perspective we spoke about earlier?
Andrew, I think I've allowed your mic, so hopefully you can come off mute there. Yep, excellent.
I'm not any through this.
Freedom to speak at last. Thank you. I work with Volunteer in Queensland, for those folks who don't know. I just wanted to emphasise why I clicked the ones I did, one of which is coming last at the moment, which is enabling a community-led approach. But the key ones I put are 3.1, making volunteering a cross-portfolio issue in government, and reshaping the public perception of volunteering, partly because I think most of those other things, including community-led approach, flow out of that. And even though my current role is in advocacy and policy around volunteering, I'm also a volunteer and on the board of a volunteer involving organisation, and have been so for decades. So I'm sort of coming from a range of perspectives, but I just feel all of the things that we're wanting to advance, including what people have answered already, really come down to getting a much deeper understanding of just how central volunteering is to almost everything within society, and having that incorporated in policy decision making and implementation, and that will only happen partly through government. And government isn't the be-all and end-all, and much of what needs to happen happens outside of government, but government can get in the way, or government can enable, and it will enable and support and invest if it understands this in the totality across all portfolios, rather than seeing volunteering as a gap filler or an afterthought or a thing to plug in or a nice to have rather than need to have. It's an essential, more essential than most of the other things that are treated as essential. So that's why I think we've got to just be far more ambitious about explaining why volunteering matters so much beyond a lot of individual case studies, but it matters so much to the just centrality of survival of society as we know it, and a few other things.
Fantastic. I love that. Survival of society and a few other things. While you're at it, why not? And you mentioned that enable a community-led approach has received the fewest votes. Not to say that it's not a really important strategic objective. I think in some cases it's that some of the other strategic objectives, it's easier to conjure up in your mind specifically what that can look like. Whereas enable a community-led approach is about listening to communities. And so what form that takes can really vary widely depending on which community you're working with and what their needs are. And so that might be part of the reason. It might just be a little further removed from people's direct experience volunteering in their teams. But yeah, I love those points you spoke to, Andrew. Thank you so much. We also had Adele with your hand up earlier. Adele, would you still like to share your points? If so, please just raise your hand. We'll be able to take you off mute. Excellent. So you should be able to unmute yourself now, Adele. And feel free to turn on your camera if you like.
Hi. Oh. Is that working? Oh, hi.
Hello.
How you going? Yeah, I think I was really interested in a lot of what Andrew said as well, and I think a focus on the perception and the value of volunteering is something that will allow us to look into and naturally capture a lot of the other areas there too, and just building on that, you know, the social capital of every element of our lives. We know about the mental health and the physical health, but just connecting people to each other, you know, in a way that they otherwise would never have met, with a, you know, a really shared passion. It's just such a wonderful sector to be involved in. And I think if more people understood how beneficial volunteering is for everyone, more people would be more likely to get involved. So I think, yeah, having that as a real focus, and everything will just naturally kind of flow, and people will see themselves and see the benefits that they can give, but also get back and then share that with their families, their communities, you know, everything around them. So, yeah.
Yeah. Sharing that human story of volunteering. I'm sure for many people in this room, that's how we got into volunteering in the first place, was you knew about someone else's involvement or the benefit for someone else. And there was that word of mouth recruitment and advocacy that we see that strengthens volunteering so much. Thank you so much, Adele.
Cheers.
And I see as well, Adria has a hand up. I'm just going to, oh, Sarah's beaten me to it. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Oh, you are still on mute now, though, so I think you have to click that button.
There we go. Thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments here. I and my team run a volunteer tutor program in New South Wales, where we match tutors with our students to give them extra support. I've made a couple of choices here. The first one is focusing on the volunteer experience. Obviously, we have to make sure that that is enjoyable for them. There's a couple of other factors that come along with that. And one of our kind of pain points is the onboarding process. So there are a lot of barriers in terms when it comes to conducting criminal checks, collecting that kind of important information from our tutors, and also when it comes to working with children checks as well. The process can be quite long. So I would really love to see some sort of improvement in that area. I think it's a real barrier that stops people from entering that kind of volunteer space, and we kind of do struggle with that as well. Also recognising the importance of volunteer management. We've got around 460 volunteers across New South Wales, and there's a team of 3 of us looking after those 460 volunteer tutors. So getting our organisations to recognise the benefit of our volunteers, and not just think of them as just volunteers. They are really huge assets to any business out there, and they're actually, not only on top of the resources that they provide our students and benefits in other ways, but there's also a monetary factor there as well. They are saving organisations a lot of money with hiring their own staff and things like that. So it's really getting that shift to move towards what assets volunteers are in that space. I did just one last thing, sorry. I did attend the State New South Wales conference, volunteer conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody shared this fantastic idea, and I thought I would like to share it with you. Somebody brought up the point of, wouldn't it be great if we had a national volunteer kind of database where people are already have that working with children check, or they have their criminal checks already sitting and approved in that system, so you can go quickly from one organisation to another, and we could sort of streamline that process a little bit. I just thought that was a really fantastic idea, and I wanted to share it with you all today. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I come from a background in volunteer management, and I've been in a situation where I needed to process 300 paper forms for people to get working with children checks for an event that was coming up in weeks, needing to individually cite everyone's ID and getting them to sign off on the forms. And this was back before Queensland had the current web interface that they have now. And yeah, I was wishing for an easier process, which Queensland has a much easier process than it did then these days. But one of the things I'll point out is, Adria, that last point you shared, I wish we had less bureaucracy, less red tape, and some interstate compatibility of this process. You're totally right. It's one of the most common things that we'll hear in feedback on this topic. And it's so common, in fact, that it came up often during our co-design of the action plan for the National Strategy for Volunteering. And in fact, it's in there as one of the actions to reflect work that has already been undertaken with state government agencies and departments working with each other. This has been an ongoing project for a while, and I think that project will continue going on for a while because it's such a complex topic when you really get down into the details of it. But the intention is there, and we're pleased to see that people come together to continue progressing that. It's one of those things that comes up, and for especially cross-border communities, we would love to see some interstate compatibility to ease the burden when volunteers are being onboarded or signing up for a new team.
And I'm not sure if we had any further. Andrew might be, I think there's a hand up there from Andrew. We might have time for one more before we wrap up and let people know next steps, because the hour has already nearly gone. Andrew, you should be able to take yourself off mute.
Hello, testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, working.
Fantastic. I just wanted to build on Adria's comments about organisations recognising the value of the volunteer contribution, so not treating them as free labour, and while they may not be paying the volunteers, resourcing the volunteer managers and department appropriately to be able to provide the rewards and incentives that keep the volunteers coming back and engaged with each other. And I think some of the ways that those barriers can be reduced is through government and industry partners, increasing messaging about the value of volunteering within organisations and how to bring down those walls and how to incentivise organisation-wide volunteering initiatives, just to change the way that organisations view volunteers and volunteerism.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Andrew. And I think there are actually a couple of people, researchers and academics on this call today who have been heavily involved in the valuing volunteering piece. And it's such a tricky thing because how do we really value something that is so intrinsically rewarding? I think about, and anyone who's heard me talk would probably hear me to be a broken record at this point, but I'm in the very privileged position, and I know Zach and Mark and Kylie and Anna who are on this call from VA would say the same thing, that we get paid to do what we do every day. But by far the most meaningful thing I do with my time is my volunteer work. And I don't know how you put a price on that, like how we actually value that. And we've tried lots of different things, wage replacement costs, but it doesn't talk to that social and cultural value of volunteering, which is something that it's one of those experiences I often say, until you do it and you feel it, you really can't describe it to someone else. But once you drink the Kool-Aid, it's also very, very difficult to give it up. Once we start volunteering, it's very difficult to stop. And I think once you're in the tent, you know that so well. And it can be really frustrating as advocates to try and get people outside the tent to understand that too. And we often, in our advocacy at Volunteering Australia, when we're having conversations, particularly with governments, we say, when we're talking about volunteers, we're not talking about 6 million people outside this room. We're talking about people sitting around this table. We're talking about ourselves, our family, our friends, our peers. Most people in Australia volunteer, whether they realise it or not, particularly people with school-age children or people playing in sport. And that's something that, one of the big questions for today's conversation, and if anyone would like to reflect on this, please do, is where could our experiences and ambitions help to shape a stronger global volunteering ecosystem? How do we, bottle that sentiment, Andrew, and take that to the world where maybe volunteering is even less valued than it is here in Australia? And that's a difficult question to answer. But if anyone did want to jump in on what we can do to help shape that stronger global volunteering ecosystem, whether that's you, Andrew, or someone else, please feel free to share in the last final minutes that we have. And I'll pop the question in the chat as well.
And I guess that's where sort of having those conversations with the accountants and HR managers that don't come from our lived experience in the volunteering space, but the accountants of the organisations are looking at cost benefit analysis. And if volunteers don't perform this function, what will it cost the organisation to pay for this function to be performed? Which is not just about salaries, because recruitment costs, retention costs, benefits, superannuation.
Yeah, and it's I'm sure I'll probably be showing my age here, but I remember when Canberra was one of the first all of jurisdictional rollouts of the NDIS, and I was working volunteering ACT at that time before I moved to VA and came west. And it was interesting because a lot of services were cashed out to the NDIS, and there was this thing about you can't just replace a volunteer with a paid employee, even if you can afford it, because the experience for consumers and for clients working with volunteers is entirely different when they know that person is choosing to be there. And that's why so many of the programs that people on this call run are so important to Australian society, is because when you are doing it as a volunteer and with a volunteer, it is entirely different to accessing a service as a consumer. And again, it's something that's so hard to articulate, but it speaks to the power and the value of volunteering. One of the things that I think is so wonderful, the word mateship came up earlier in that conversation. And one of the things we do really well here in Australia is we help our neighbours and we help out people who need, and we see that so often with emergencies. Zach knows that better than I do, being up in Queensland. Andrew from Volunteering Queensland would know as well how much work we do in that space. But these are the sorts of things where, how do we bottle that up and then give that to IAVE and the global dialogue to say these are the things we can learn from, but also the things we need to not take for granted.
And Kim's just put a great point in the chat as well, kind of taking it to that next higher level of thinking about what we mean by volunteering, and that volunteering isn't always a word people use to describe what they're doing. It doesn't always match their experience. And Kim has asked the room, do we need to change our language around it to bring everyone's experiences into the conversation? And sometimes you see this come into effect where people have strategically chosen to use other terms and then maybe bring it back to the term volunteering later in the conversation. So if you're looking for input from communities that are more likely to be volunteering outside of organizations, often referred to as informally, then you might use the term helping, something like that. Or for some people might just describe it as being part of a community. And some people don't enjoy having a label at all because in their mind, it might take away a little bit of what's special about it that Sarah and Andrew were just speaking to a moment ago. And, there's going to be some languages out there where there isn't a direct translation of what we term volunteering. A lot of our volunteer experience in Australia, especially if you look at volunteering through institutions, comes back to Australia's particular history and place in the world, which is not always one-for-one directly compatible with the experiences of, for example, people who have newly arrived in Australia from other countries, or people who live overseas, or might be in communities themselves within Australia, perhaps in more regional areas or First Nations communities. Spending time is another term that Carrie's put in. I remember making a list one day for a document and coming up with about a dozen different euphemisms for volunteering. But, it is handy to have a word that we use in at least some context, but keeping that flexibility in mind when you're engaging diverse audiences is key.
I think we're pretty much about at time. The hour always goes really fast. And thank you so much to the over 100 people who have joined us today. In an ideal world, we would do these face-to-face and we do lots of them. But, given that volunteering is in every single corner of the Australian community and we're a very small team, it is a bit difficult for us to reach out to people. But this isn't the end of the conversation. So one of the things that we'll be doing over the next 6 months is feeding back key messages to IAVE. What are the 3 to 5 sort of most important messages from Australia that we want them to know about volunteering in that global sense coming into IAVE 2026? So another way that you can participate in this conversation is to fill out IAVE's survey. I am popping the link in the chat now, but we will also send it through via email as well. It takes about 10 minutes. It asks similar questions to the ones today, but in a lot more detail. And it's a chance for you to give your input into that. It asks you whether you're doing it as a volunteer or another type of practitioner. You can only do it once, and often it's hard to separate those hats, but please do fill out the survey because it asks where you're calling in from, and I think there's a QR code on the screen there as well, so it asks where you're responding from. If we can have lots of responses from Australia, it really does demonstrate that we do see ourselves as leaders in that space and want that responsibility as well. So as I mentioned, the IAVE global call to action for IAVE 2026 will be launching this year in December, ahead of the work that will happen next year. Please complete the survey. Please share it with your networks. It's open for another 2 weeks. You are very welcome, and we encourage you to share it with colleagues, to share it with your own volunteers if you work for a VIO. Pop it on LinkedIn, anywhere you might have connections with people who can fill it out. It is even for people who don't necessarily think for them. And sometimes those are the voices we do like to hear from just as much, because it is interesting to get different perspectives. If you have other feedback after today that you'd like to share with us, if there was something you think, if you're like me and you have a shower thought at 10 o'clock tonight, please feel free to contact myself or Zach or the Volunteering Australia team and let us know if you think there's something else in terms of key messages that you'd like us to share with IAVE. And as more opportunities for this come up to keep you engaged, we'd love to hear again from you, and you'll certainly hear from us in the lead up to the launch of that global call to action.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.